The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine white marble of the Blackwood mansion when 10-year-old Zara Williams pressed her face against the cold iron gates. Her small hands gripped the bars as she watched the chaos unfold in the courtyard beyond. Security guards rushed back and forth, their radios crackling with urgent messages. Black SUVs lined the circular driveway like a funeral procession. But it wasn't a funeral that brought this commotion to the doorstep of one of America's wealthiest families. It was something far more sinister. Your son was taken to the boat. Zara's voice pierced through the morning air, stopping every guard, every servant, every person within earshot dead in their tracks. The words hung in the silence like a death sentence. Because in that moment, everyone understood what the little girl meant. The boat wasn't just any boat. It was the vessel that had become whispered legend among the staff, the place where people disappeared and secrets were buried beneath dark waters. Marcus Blackwood, the billionaire tech mogul whose empire stretched across continents, felt his blood turn to ice as he stepped out of his Rolls-Royce. He had built his fortune on predicting the future, on seeing patterns others missed. But he had failed to see the most dangerous pattern of all, the one growing right under his own roof. The girl at the gate wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to know anything about boats or suns or the deadly game being played in the shadows of his perfect life. Yet here she stood, this child from the nearby projects, holding the key to a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved and the boy he had come to see as his own. As Marcus approached the gates, his mind raced through the events of the past few months. The mysterious accidents that had befallen his business rivals. The way his lover Rebecca's son, David, had grown increasingly cold and calculating. The strange phone calls that stopped whenever he entered a room. The yacht trips that David took with friends, trips that Rebecca insisted were just innocent teenage adventures. But innocent teenagers didn't make people disappear. Innocent teenagers didn't have connections to underground networks that trafficked in human misery. And innocent teenagers certainly didn't plan to eliminate their mother's wealthy boyfriend to claim an inheritance that wasn't rightfully theirs. Zara's eyes met Marcus's through the gates, and in that moment, he saw not just a child trying to warn him, but a survivor who had witnessed something that no child should ever see. Her presence here meant that David's plans had already gone too far. It meant that somewhere out on the dark waters of the Atlantic, a boat was carrying cargo that would expose the most elaborate and deadly deception ever played against him. The clock was ticking. Lives hung in the balance. And Marcus Blackwood, the man who had conquered every challenge in his path to billions, was about to face the fight of his life, not for his fortune, but for justice, truth, and the lives of the innocent. This is the story of how one brave little girl's warning became the thread that unraveled a web of lies, corruption, and murder that reached from the poorest streets to the highest echelons of power. It's a story about the courage it takes to speak truth to power, the price of blind trust, and the lengths to which evil will go to achieve its goals. But, most of all, it's a story about how sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and the most innocent voices carry the power to expose the darkest truths. Marcus Blackwood had always prided himself on reading people. In the cutthroat world of technology and business, the ability to see through facades had made him billions. But, as he stood in his marble foyer that Tuesday morning, watching Rebecca Sterling descend the grand staircase in her silk robe, he wondered how he had missed the signs that were now so glaringly obvious. The previous evening had been perfect, or so it had seemed. They had dined on the terrace overlooking the ocean, discussing their upcoming engagement party. Rebecca had been radiant, her auburn hair catching the sunset, her green eyes sparkling with what he had believed was genuine love. Her son David had joined them for dessert, charming and articulate as always, discussing his plans for college with the kind of mature insight that had impressed Marcus from the beginning. Now, 20 hours later, everything felt different. The morning light revealed details that candlelight had hidden, and the little girl's warning echoed in his mind like a curse. "Good morning, darling," Rebecca said, her voice carrying its usual warmth as she approached him. She rose on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek, and he caught the scent of her expensive perfume mixed with something else, something that made his stomach turn. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. Rebecca, we need to talk, Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. He had built his empire on strategic patience, never revealing his hand until the perfect moment. But this was different. This involved lives, possibly including his own. She pulled back slightly, studying his face with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years reading the moods of powerful men. Rebecca Sterling had been many things before she became his lover. A model in her youth, then the wife of a Wall Street executive who died in what the police had ruled an accidental drowning. After that, she had dated a series of wealthy men, each relationship ending with her somehow better positioned than before. Marcus had known about her past when they met at a charity gala 18 months ago. What he hadn't known was how that past connected to a present that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. Of course, she said, settling into the cream-colored sofa in his living room. What's troubling you? Before he could answer, David appeared at the top of the stairs. At 19, Rebecca's son possessed an unsettling combination of boyish charm and calculated intelligence. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his clothes expensive but understated. Everything about him suggested privilege and refinement, yet something in his pale blue eyes had always made Marcus slightly uncomfortable. "Morning, Marcus," David said, jogging down the stairs with athletic grace. "Hope you don't mind. I invited a few friends over later to use the pool." "Actually, David, I'd prefer if you canceled those plans," Marcus replied, watching the young man's reaction carefully. For just a moment, something flickered across David's features. Anger, perhaps, or calculation. Then, the charming smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure, no problem. Everything okay?" Marcus was about to respond when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Sarah Chun, a contact he hadn't expected to hear from again. 5 months ago, Detective Chun had investigated a break-in at one of Marcus's offices. Nothing had been stolen, but the incident had left him uneasy. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to take the call. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you some questions about a young woman named Zara Williams." Marcus felt his blood chill. "What about her?" "She's been asking around the precinct about you, claiming she has information about a crime. Something about boats and missing people. Do you know what she might be talking about?" Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus could see his private beach stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, if Zara was telling the truth, a boat carried evidence of crimes he couldn't yet fully comprehend. "I think I do," he said quietly. "Detective, I need to see you as soon as possible." When he hung up, Rebecca and David were watching him with identical expressions of concern that now seemed horribly false. "Who was that, darling?" Rebecca asked. Marcus looked at her, this woman he had planned to marry, and realized how little he truly knew her. The charitable foundation she claimed to run, the investment firm that provided her income, even the story of her husband's death. How much of it was real? "Just business," he lied, then turned to David. "Actually, I've changed my mind about your friends. Why don't you invite them over? I'd like to meet them." Something shifted in the room's atmosphere. David's smile became strained, and Rebecca's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, touching the diamond necklace Marcus had given her for her last birthday. "They're just school friends," David said. "Nothing special." "I insist," Marcus replied. "I'm curious about the young people you spend time with." What Marcus didn't say was that he was particularly curious about the friends who might have access to boats, or who might have connections to the kind of underground networks that could make people disappear. According to his security team's preliminary investigation, David's social circle included several young men with criminal records, trust fund kids who used their wealth and connections to engage in increasingly dangerous activities. Rebecca stood up abruptly. "I should get dressed. We're having lunch with the Hendersons, remember?" Marcus had forgotten about the social obligation, but now it seemed less important than ever. The Hendersons could wait. Truth couldn't. "Actually, why don't you and David go ahead without me? I have some business to take care of." For the first time since he had known her, Rebecca looked genuinely afraid. "What kind of business?" Before Marcus could answer, his security chief, James Morrison, appeared in the doorway. A former FBI agent with 30 years of experience, James had worked for Marcus for the past 5 years. His expression was grim. "Sir, we need to talk privately," James said. Marcus nodded and followed James into his study, leaving Rebecca and David in the living room. As soon as the door closed, James handed him a tablet displaying surveillance footage. This was recorded at the marina last night at 2:47 a.m., James explained. The grainy black and white video showed a figure Marcus recognized as David walking quickly along the dock. He was carrying something, though the resolution made it difficult to determine what. More disturbing was the way David kept looking over his shoulder, clearly nervous about being observed. There's more, James said, swiping to the next video. This is from 3 weeks ago. The second video showed David with two other young men loading what appeared to be heavy objects onto a sleek white yacht. The timestamp indicated the activity had occurred at nearly 4 in the morning. Have you identified the other individuals? Marcus asked. Yes, Tony Castellano and Michael Jean. Both have records for assault and drug trafficking. Castellano's father owns a shipping company with ties to organized crime. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The mysterious boat trips, the late-night absences, the way David always seemed to have more money than his allowance should have provided. James, I want you to contact the Coast Guard immediately. If there's a boat out there carrying evidence of crimes, we need to find it before. He was interrupted by a crash from the living room, followed by Rebecca's voice raised in anger. Marcus and James rushed back to find Rebecca and David in heated argument. I told you to be more careful, Rebecca was saying, her composed mask finally slipping. Mom, calm down. Everything's under control, David replied. But his voice carried an edge Marcus had never heard before. They both stopped talking when they saw Marcus, but the damage was done. Whatever they were discussing, it confirmed his worst suspicions. Rebecca, I think it's time you told me the truth, Marcus said. About everything. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her calculating her options. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. I don't know what you think you know, but you're making a mistake, she said. David is a good boy. Sometimes teenagers make poor choices, but that doesn't mean, what kind of poor choices? Marcus interrupted. David stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from defensive to aggressive. Look, Marcus, I appreciate everything you've done for us, but my personal life is my business. Not when it involves criminal activity conducted from my property using resources I've provided. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus watched his mother and son exchange glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. You're being paranoid, Rebecca said finally. There's no criminal activity. David goes out with friends sometimes. That's what young people do. But, even as she spoke, Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. She knew he was close to discovering something that would destroy their carefully constructed world. His phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Chun. The Williams girl wants to meet. She says she has photos. Marcus looked up to find David staring at him with undisguised hatred. In that moment, the charming, respectful young man he thought he knew vanished, replaced by someone cold and dangerous. You know what, Marcus? David said, his voice eerily calm. Maybe it's time you understood how things really work around here. The threat was unmistakable. Marcus realized that he was no longer dealing with a teenager's rebellious phase. He was facing something far more sinister, something that had been growing under his roof like a cancer. Rebecca grabbed David's arm. Stop it. We're leaving. No, Marcus said firmly. I think you should both. Detective Sarah Chun had seen enough crime scenes to know when someone was lying. And, as she sat across from Zara Williams in the interview room of the local community center, every instinct told her the 10-year-old was telling the truth. The child's hands trembled as she clutched a worn stuffed elephant. But her voice remained steady as she recounted what she had witnessed 3 nights ago. I wasn't supposed to be at the docks, Zara began, her dark eyes focused on something beyond the detective's shoulder. Mama always says it's dangerous there at night. But I was following my brother Jerome. He's been acting strange lately, coming home with money he shouldn't have. Detective Chun leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice gentle. What did you see at the docks, Zara? There was this big white boat, real fancy like the ones rich people have. And there were these boys, older than Jerome, but not really men yet. They were putting something heavy into the water, something wrapped in plastic. The detective felt a chill run down her spine. Missing persons cases had been increasing in the area over the past 6 months, but, without bodies or witnesses, the investigations had stalled. Can you describe these boys? One had dark hair, real neat like he was going somewhere important. He was telling the others what to do, acting like he was the boss. Another one was big, with muscles and tattoos on his arms. The third one looked nervous, kept checking his phone and looking around. The description of the dark-haired leader matched David Sterling perfectly. Detective Chun had already run background checks after Marcus Blackwood's call, and what she had found was disturbing. David's juvenile record had been sealed, but she had contacts who could provide information. The picture that emerged was of a young man with a history of manipulation, theft, and increasingly violent behavior. Zara, did you recognize any of these boys? Had you seen them before? The girl nodded reluctantly. The nervous one, I think his name is Tommy. My cousin Lisa knows him from school. She said he's got a rich girlfriend and drives a fancy car even though he's only 17. Detective Chun made a note. Tommy Castellano, most likely. Son of Vincent Castellano, whose shipping company had been under federal investigation for money laundering and human trafficking. The pieces were starting to form a picture that made her stomach turn. What happened after they put the wrapped object in the water? They got back on the boat and went out real far, past where I could see. But they came back maybe an hour later, and they were arguing. The boss boy was angry, saying something about how they needed to be more careful because people were asking questions. People like who? Zara shrugged. I don't know. But then, the big boy with tattoos said something about making sure the rich man didn't find out. That's when I knew they were talking about Mr. Blackwood. Detective Chun had met Marcus Blackwood during the investigation of the break-in at his office 5 months earlier. He had struck her as intelligent and straightforward, not the type to get involved with criminals willingly. But wealthy men often made poor choices when it came to the women they dated. How did you know they were talking about Mr. Blackwood specifically? Because the boss boy called him by name. He said, Marcus won't suspect anything if we're careful. Then, he said something about his mama keeping him happy while they finished their business. The exploitation was becoming clear. Rebecca Sterling had been assigned to keep Marcus distracted while her son and his associates used his resources and reputation to cover their criminal activities. But what was their endgame? Murder for inheritance seemed likely, but Detective Chin suspected the operation was more complex than a simple kill-for-money scheme. Her phone rang, interrupting the interview. The caller ID showed Marcus Blackwood's number. Mr. Blackwood, I'm with the witness now. Can you tell me where Rebecca and David are currently? They left about 20 minutes ago, claiming they were going to lunch with friends. But my security chief tracked them to the marina instead. They're on David's yacht. Detective Chun felt her pulse quicken. If they were destroying evidence, the investigation could lose its only chance at stopping whatever David had planned. Mr. Blackwood, I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't try to follow them, and don't let them know you're monitoring their movements. I'm sending units to the marina now. She hung up and immediately called for backup, then turned back to Zara. You've been very brave, but I need to ask you something important. You said you were following your brother Jerome. Why? What has he been doing? Zara's expression grew worried. He's been meeting with those same boys. They gave him money to do things for them, like watch certain houses and follow certain people. I think he's been watching Mr. Blackwood's house. The surveillance network was more extensive than Detective Chun had initially suspected. David's operation wasn't just about getting close to Marcus through his mother. They had been conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering, probably planning every detail of whatever crime they intended to commit. Is Jerome here today? Can I speak with him? He's at home, but he won't talk to police. He's scared of those boys. He told me they said they'd hurt our family if he didn't do what they asked. Detective Chin realized that Zara's family had been threatened into cooperation, which meant David's group was willing to use violence against children to achieve their goals. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. Her radio crackled with a message from the units heading to the marina. Detective Chun, we're approaching the location. The yacht is still docked, but we can see movement on board. Proceed with caution, but don't approach until I arrive. Treat this as potentially armed and dangerous. As she prepared to leave the community center, Detective Chin looked down at Zara, whose courage in coming forward had likely prevented a serious crime. Zara, you did the right thing by telling me about this. But I need you to promise me something. Don't go near the docks again. And if you see any of those boys, you call me immediately. The drive to the marina took 12 minutes that felt like an hour. Detective Chin's mind raced through the possibilities of what David's group might be planning. Insurance fraud seemed too simple for such an elaborate operation. Identity theft was possible, but why involve boats and missing people? The most likely scenario was that they were planning to murder Marcus and make it look like an accident. But first they needed to eliminate any witnesses to their previous crimes. The marina was bustling with afternoon activity when she arrived, which would make any arrest complicated. Families with children walked along the docks, and tourists took photos of the expensive yachts. David had chosen the timing carefully, betting that law enforcement wouldn't risk a confrontation in such a public setting. Officer Martinez approached her car as she parked. "Detective, we've identified the yacht. It's registered to Sterling Holdings, which traces back to Rebecca Sterling. There are currently 4 people on board, 2 adults and 2 juveniles. Any sign of weapons?" "Negative, but we've observed them moving large objects around on deck. Could be evidence disposal." Detective Chun surveyed the scene through binoculars. The yacht was impressive, probably worth several $1,000,000. Rebecca Sterling's supposed income from her investment firm wouldn't support such a purchase, which meant the money had come from somewhere else, possibly from Marcus himself, in which case they were using his own resources to plan his destruction. "What's the plan, Detective?" Officer Martinez asked. Before she could answer, her phone rang again. This time it was James Morrison, Marcus Blackwood's security chief. "Detective Chun, we have a problem. I just received intelligence that there's a second boat involved. David's associates are planning to meet him at sea, possibly to transfer evidence or weapons." "What kind of intelligence?" "We've been monitoring their communications. They're using encrypted messaging, but we managed to intercept enough to know they're planning something for tonight. They mentioned coordinates about 20 miles offshore." The operation was more sophisticated than Detective Chun had anticipated. David's group wasn't just a collection of wealthy teenagers playing at crime. They had resources, planning capabilities, and apparently access to technology that most criminals their age wouldn't possess. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to share everything you've intercepted with my department immediately. This has become a federal investigation." As she hung up, Detective Chin realized that stopping David's group would require more resources than the local police department possessed. She called the FBI field office and requested immediate assistance, knowing that crimes involving boats in international waters fell under federal jurisdiction. While waiting for federal agents to arrive, she watched the yacht through binoculars and noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the figures on deck appeared to be tied up. If David was holding someone prisoner, the situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Her radio crackled again. "Detective, we're picking up distress signals from a boat approximately 15 miles offshore. Coast Guard is responding, but they're requesting law enforcement support." The pieces were falling into place. David's group had been the white yacht cut through the choppy waters of the Atlantic like a knife, its powerful engines pushing it toward the horizon at speeds that made pursuit challenging. From the Coast Guard vessel that had joined the chase, Detective Chin watched through high-powered binoculars as figures moved frantically on the yacht's deck. The FBI agents who had arrived just minutes before the yacht departed were coordinating with multiple agencies to create a perimeter that would prevent David's escape to international waters. "Detective, we're picking up radio chatter from the suspect vessel," announced Coast Guard Captain Rodriguez. "They're communicating with another boat. Coordinates suggest a rendezvous point about 18 miles northeast of our current position." The second boat that James Morrison had mentioned was becoming a reality. Detective Chun realized that David's operation was even more sophisticated than they had suspected. While everyone focused on the obvious yacht, the real criminal assets might be aboard a vessel they hadn't even identified yet. "Can we intercept their communications?" "We're working on it, but they're using military-grade encryption. Someone with serious resources set up their communication system." Agent Lisa Park of the FBI approached with a tablet displaying satellite imagery. "Detective Chun, we've identified the second vessel. It's a converted cargo ship registered to a company that traces back to Vincent Castellano. According to our intelligence, it's been used for human trafficking operations along the eastern seaboard." The scope of the criminal enterprise was becoming clear. This wasn't just about David Sterling plotting against Marcus Blackwood. The young man had somehow become connected to organized crime families who used wealthy teenagers as fronts for their operations. The yacht chase was just the visible tip of a much larger criminal iceberg. Agent Park, what's our tactical situation? We have Coast Guard cutters approaching from 2 directions, FBI tactical teams on helicopters, and local police coordinating from shore. But we're dealing with a sophisticated enemy who's had months to plan escape routes. Detective Chen's phone rang with a call from Marcus Blackwood. Against her instructions, he had apparently left his mansion and was now monitoring the situation from his own boat. Mr. Blackwood, I specifically told you to stay on shore, she said, trying to control her frustration. Detective, I couldn't sit and wait while people who betrayed my trust escape justice. Besides, I know these waters better than anyone. I can help. Before she could respond, Marcus continued with information that changed everything. There's something you need to know about Rebecca. I just spoke with my private investigator, and her background is completely fabricated. Rebecca Sterling doesn't exist. The woman I've been living with for 18 months is actually Rebecca Chun, and she's wanted by Interpol for her involvement in international fraud schemes. The revelation hit Detective Sarah Chun like a physical blow. The name was too close to her own to be coincidence. Mr. Blackwood, did you say Rebecca Chin? Yes. According to my investigator, she's originally from Hong Kong and has been using different identities across multiple countries. She specializes in seducing wealthy men and manipulating them into criminal activities. Detective Chun felt the world tilt around her. Rebecca Chun was her sister, the sister who had disappeared 15 years ago after stealing money from their family's business and breaking their parents' hearts. The sister she had thought was dead. Agent Park, she said, her voice carefully controlled. I need to disclose a potential conflict of interest. But, before she could explain, the Coast Guard radio crackled with urgent news. All units, the suspect yacht has reached the rendezvous point. We have visual on the cargo vessel, and it appears to be preparing to receive passengers. Through the binoculars, Detective Chun watched as the white yacht pulled alongside the much larger cargo ship. The contrast was striking. The sleek, expensive pleasure craft next to the rust-stained industrial vessel that had clearly seen years of hard use and questionable activities. Captain Rodriguez, how long before we reach their position? 12 minutes at current speed, but they'll be gone before we arrive if they transfer to the cargo ship. That vessel has engines powerful enough to outrun anything we have in the area. Agent Park was coordinating with her FBI colleagues via satellite phone. Detective, we're getting confirmation that the cargo ship has been modified with hidden compartments and advanced navigation systems. This isn't just human trafficking. It's a floating criminal headquarters. The implications were staggering. David Sterling hadn't just fallen in with bad company. He had somehow become integral to an international criminal operation that used his mother's relationships with wealthy men to fund and cover their activities. All units, we need to prevent that transfer, Detective Chun announced over the radio. If they reach the cargo ship, we lose our chance to stop this entire network. What happened next unfolded like a scene from an action movie. The Coast Guard helicopter swooped low over the yacht, using its downdraft to make maneuvering difficult while warning sirens echoed across the water. But, instead of surrendering, the people on the yacht began throwing objects overboard, evidence being destroyed even as law enforcement closed in. They're dumping everything, Captain Rodriguez observed grimly. Whatever they don't want us to find is going to the bottom of the ocean. But, then, something unexpected happened. One of the figures on the yacht, Detective Chun realized it was David Sterling himself, began waving frantically at the helicopter. Not in surrender, but in what appeared to be panic. Captain, are you seeing this? Something's wrong on that boat. Through the binoculars, Detective Chun watched as chaos erupted on the yacht's deck. The bound figure she had noticed earlier was now clearly visible as an elderly man who was being held against his will. But more disturbing was the fact that David appeared to be arguing violently with the other people on board, including his own mother. The Coast Guard radio suddenly picked up a transmission from the yacht itself. Coast Guard, this is David Sterling aboard the yacht Destiny. I need help. These people have taken me prisoner, and they're planning to kill someone. Agent Park looked at Detective Chun in confusion. Is he claiming to be a victim? Before anyone could process this development fully, gunshots rang out across the water. Someone on the cargo ship was firing toward the yacht, apparently trying to prevent David from communicating with law enforcement. All units, we have active shooting. Treat this as a hostage situation, Detective Chin announced. The tactical situation had changed completely. Instead of pursuing fleeing criminals, they were now dealing with what appeared to be a kidnapping in progress, with victims who included the very people they had been trying to arrest. Marcus Blackwood's voice came through on her phone, which she had forgotten was still connected. Detective, I can see the shooting from here. David isn't the criminal. He's trying to escape from them. My God, I think Rebecca has been using her own son as bait. The truth was becoming clear in the most horrific way possible. Rebecca Chun had seduced Marcus not just to rob him, but to use her relationship with him to give her criminal associates access to his resources. David, despite his involvement in the surveillance and planning, had apparently discovered something that made him turn against his mother's associates. Captain Rodriguez, we need to board that yacht immediately. We have hostages and active criminals. The Coast Guard cutter moved into position for a tactical boarding while the helicopter maintained suppressing fire toward the cargo ship. But the criminals aboard the larger vessel weren't retreating. Instead, they were moving closer to the yacht, apparently planning to eliminate the witnesses rather than rescue them. Detective, Agent Park said urgently, satellite imagery shows at least 8 armed individuals on the cargo ship. They're preparing to board the yacht. The rescue had become a race against time. Detective Chun watched as armed figures began transferring from the cargo ship to the yacht via small boats. David Sterling's attempt to call for help had triggered a violent response from criminals who clearly believed that killing everyone involved was preferable to being exposed. All units, close on the yacht immediately. We cannot allow those armed individuals to complete their mission. As the Coast Guard vessel accelerated toward the confrontation, Detective Chin thought about Zara Williams, whose courage in coming forward had started this entire chain of events. The little girl had risked her safety to warn about crimes she couldn't fully understand, and now multiple lives hung in the balance based on her testimony. The sound of gunfire intensified as they approached the yacht. Through the binoculars, Detective Chun could see David Sterling and the elderly prisoner taking cover behind the yacht's superstructure while armed figures advanced on their position. Rebecca was nowhere to be seen, possibly having moved to the cargo ship when the shooting started. 60 seconds to boarding, Captain Rodriguez announced. The boarding of the yacht Destiny was unlike any operation Detective Sarah Chun had ever experienced. As Coast Guard tactical teams secured the deck amid sporadic gunfire from the cargo ship, she found herself face to face with the elderly hostage, who turned out to be Judge Harrison Webb, a federal judge who had been reported missing 3 days earlier. Judge Webb, are you injured? She asked while helping him to a secure position behind the yacht's wheelhouse. I'm fine, but you need to know what these people are planning, the 72-year-old judge said, his voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. They didn't kidnap me randomly. I've been presiding over cases involving international money laundering, and they wanted information about upcoming federal investigations. The criminal operation was even more sophisticated than anyone had suspected. Rebecca's network wasn't just committing crimes. They were actively working to undermine federal law enforcement by targeting judges and officials who threatened their activities. David Sterling crouched nearby, his expensive clothes torn and bloody from trying to protect Judge Webb during the gunfire. When Detective Chin approached him, she saw not the calculating young criminal she had expected, but a terrified teenager who had gotten in over his head. David, I need to understand what happened here. Why did you contact the Coast Guard? The young man looked up at her with eyes that seemed much older than his 19 years. Detective, I need to tell you everything. But first you have to understand. My mother isn't who you think she is. She isn't even who I thought she was. Agent Park joined them behind cover as gunfire continued to echo across the water. The FBI tactical helicopter was engaging the armed figures on the cargo ship, trying to prevent them from escaping while Coast Guard vessels moved to surround the larger vessel. David, we know your mother is using a false identity. What we need to know is how deep her criminal connections go and how many people are in immediate danger. David took a shuddering breath before beginning his confession. It started when I was 16. Mom told me we were going to live with a wealthy man who could provide opportunities for my future. I thought she had just fallen in love with someone rich. But after we moved in with Marcus, strange people started contacting me. What kind of people? Men who claimed to work for my mother's business associates. They said I needed to help gather information about Marcus's finances, his business connections, his daily routines. They made it seem like corporate intelligence gathering. Detective Chen realized that David had been manipulated and recruited gradually, probably without understanding the ultimate goals of the operation. When did you realize it was something more serious? 3 weeks ago, when they brought Judge Webb to the boat. That's when I understood that my mother wasn't just running investment scams. She was part of something that involved kidnapping federal officials and threatening their families. The picture was becoming clearer, but it was also becoming more horrifying. Rebecca Chen's operation wasn't just about stealing money from wealthy men. It was about creating a criminal infrastructure that could corrupt the legal system itself. Agent Park's radio crackled with an update from the FBI helicopter. Ground teams, be advised that we're seeing movement on the cargo ship consistent with preparation for scuttling the vessel. They may be planning to destroy evidence by sinking the ship. David, how many people are aboard that cargo ship? Detective Chun asked urgently. I don't know exactly, but they mentioned having between 15 and 20 operatives. Plus, there are other prisoners besides Judge Webb, people they kidnapped from other operations. The rescue mission had just become exponentially more complicated. If the cargo ship was carrying multiple kidnapping victims, and the criminals were preparing to sink it, they had minutes rather than hours to prevent a massive loss of life. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the radio. All units, satellite imagery confirms the cargo ship is taking on water in controlled amounts. They're definitely preparing to scuttle. Detective Chun made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Agent Park, I need you to coordinate the assault on the cargo ship. I'm staying here with the witnesses to get information we'll need to identify all the victims and perpetrators. Detective, that's not protocol. You should. Agent Park, my sister is on that cargo ship, and I know her better than anyone else here. David can provide tactical information about the layout and personnel, but I need to get that information while there's still time to use it. Agent Park looked shocked at the revelation about Detective Chin's sister, but nodded grimly and moved to coordinate with the tactical teams. David, I need everything you know about that ship. Layout, personnel, where they might be holding prisoners, everything. The young man seemed to focus despite his fear. The ship has been modified with hidden compartments on 3 levels. The prisoners are kept in the lowest level, below the cargo hold. There are about 8 guards who rotate in shifts, plus the technical crew that runs the communications and navigation equipment. What about weapons? They have military-grade equipment, assault rifles, body armor, and I think they mentioned explosives for destroying evidence. Judge Webb, who had been listening to the conversation, added crucial information. Detective, they've been using that ship as a mobile headquarters for at least 6 months. I overheard conversations about operations in multiple states, possibly multiple countries. The scope of Rebecca Chin's criminal empire was staggering. While everyone had focused on her relationship with Marcus Blackwood, she had been running an international operation that threatened the integrity of the entire federal judicial system. Detective Chin's radio buzzed with a message from Marcus Blackwood, who was apparently monitoring law enforcement communications from his own boat. Detective, I've been tracking financial records while you've been dealing with the rescue. Rebecca has been systematically emptying my accounts for months, but not just to steal the money. She's been using my funds to finance weapons purchases and boat modifications. I've unknowingly been funding a criminal army. The betrayal was complete. Rebecca had not only seduced Marcus for access to his wealth, but had turned him into an unwitting accomplice in financing crimes that threatened national security. Mr. Blackwood, we'll need all of those financial records as evidence, but right now we need to focus on stopping the immediate threat. Gunfire intensified as Coast Guard and FBI tactical teams began their assault on the cargo ship. Through binoculars, Detective Chun could see figures moving frantically on the ship's deck, some apparently preparing defensive positions while others seemed to be carrying equipment toward the water. They're throwing computers and files overboard, she announced over the radio. Evidence destruction is proceeding rapidly. David grabbed her arm urgently. Detective, there's something else you need to know. My mother mentioned having contingency plans if the operation was exposed. She said something about a final solution that would eliminate all the witnesses and investigators. What kind of final solution? Before David could answer, a massive explosion rocked the cargo ship, sending flames and debris high into the air. The criminals had apparently decided that destroying everything was preferable to being captured. All units, the cargo ship is burning and listing heavily to starboard, Captain Rodriguez announced. We have approximately 10 minutes before it sinks completely. The rescue operation had become a desperate race against time. Somewhere in the burning, sinking ship were kidnapping victims who would die if they weren't found and evacuated immediately. But the same explosion that threatened the victims' lives had also destroyed evidence that might have been crucial for dismantling the entire criminal network. Detective Chun watched the flames consume the ship and realized that Rebecca Chen's final act of defiance might be to take her secrets to the bottom of the ocean, leaving investigators with questions that would never be answered. David, I need you to think carefully. Did your mother ever mention other boats, other locations, other operations? If this ship goes down with its crew and prisoners, there might be other cells of this organization still operating. 3 months after the dramatic rescue at sea, Detective Sarah Chen stood in the federal courthouse watching as the final sentences were handed down in what had become known as the Sterling conspiracy case. Judge Harrison Webb, fully recovered from his ordeal, had recused himself from the proceedings due to his status as a victim, but he observed from the gallery as justice was finally served. David Sterling, now 20 and looking much older than his years, received a sentence of 5 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole in 3 years. His cooperation with federal investigators had been crucial in dismantling the remainder of his mother's criminal network, and his genuine remorse had impressed both prosecutors and the judge. Your Honor, David had said during his sentencing hearing, I know that saying I was manipulated doesn't excuse the harm I caused. Judge Webb, Mr. Blackwood, and all the other victims deserved better. I spend every day trying to figure out how I can make amends for the pain my actions caused. The young man's transformation had been remarkable to witness. The arrogant, calculating teenager who had once helped surveil Marcus Blackwood's house had become someone capable of genuine empathy and accountability. Prison would be difficult for him, but Detective Chen believed he might emerge as someone capable of contributing positively to society. Marcus Blackwood had established a victim compensation fund using the millions of dollars that federal investigators had recovered from Rebecca Chen's network. The fund would provide support for the families of people who had been kidnapped, murdered, or otherwise victimized by the criminal organization. Additionally, Marcus had created a scholarship program for disadvantaged children, with Zara Williams as its first recipient. Mr. Blackwood, Detective Chun had told him after the final court session, you've turned a personal tragedy into something that will help others. That shows real character. Marcus had smiled sadly. Detective, I'll never stop blaming myself for being so blind to what was happening under my own roof. But if some good can come from this horror, then at least the victims won't have suffered for nothing. The investigation into Rebecca Chen's international criminal empire had revealed a network that spanned 5 countries and involved dozens of co-conspirators. Federal agents had arrested operatives in Miami, San Francisco, Hong Kong, London, and Amsterdam. The organization had been responsible for kidnapping federal officials, money laundering, human trafficking, and at least 12 murders that investigators could prove. But Rebecca Chen herself remained a ghost. Despite an international manhunt and a reward of $1 million for information leading to her capture, she had vanished completely. Some intelligence suggested she had plastic surgery and was living under a new identity in South America. Others believed she had been killed by her own associates to prevent her from revealing more secrets. Detective Chun had accepted a promotion to work with a federal task force dedicated to tracking international criminal organizations. The personal pain of learning about her sister's true nature had been devastating, but it had also motivated her to ensure that other families wouldn't suffer the same betrayal. Sarah, her partner Agent Lisa Park, had told her during their most recent case briefing, I know this has been personal for you, but you've helped save dozens of lives by breaking up Rebecca's network. That has to count for something. Detective Chin appreciated the support, But she knew that her work wouldn't be complete until Rebecca Chun was behind bars or confirmed dead. Every morning, she reviewed intelligence reports hoping for any sign of her sister's location. Zara Williams had become something of a local hero, though she remained a normal 10-year-old who was more interested in playing with her friends than discussing her role in exposing a criminal conspiracy. The scholarship Marcus Blackwood had provided would ensure her education through college, and her family had received counseling and support to help them process the trauma of being threatened by criminals. "Miss Detective," Zara had said during their last meeting, "do you think the bad people will try to hurt anyone else?" "I hope not, Zara. But if they do, I hope there are brave people like you willing to speak up and tell the truth." The child's courage had been the catalyst that saved multiple lives and exposed crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Detective Chin often wondered how many other criminal operations were hidden behind facades of respectability, waiting for someone with Zara's moral clarity to expose them. Judge Webb had returned to his federal bench with enhanced security and a renewed dedication to fighting organized crime. His experience as a kidnapping victim had given him unique insight into the psychological tactics that criminals use to break down their victims' resistance. "Detective Chun," he had said after sentencing David Sterling, "that young man's testimony about how his mother gradually recruited him into criminal activity will be valuable for identifying other cases of familial criminal exploitation." The psychological aspects of the case had fascinated criminal justice experts. Rebecca Chun had used her own son as both an accomplice and ultimately a victim, demonstrating a level of manipulative cruelty that challenged conventional understanding of criminal behavior. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated David Sterling, explained the phenomenon to Detective Chun during a consultation. "Rebecca Chun represents a particularly dangerous type of criminal sociopath. She was able to maintain multiple false identities while manipulating both intimate partners and family members. The fact that she was willing to sacrifice her own son when the operation was exposed shows a complete absence of normal human emotional attachments." The academic community had begun studying the Sterling conspiracy as an example of how criminal organizations were evolving to exploit modern wealth inequality and social mobility. Rebecca's strategy of targeting wealthy men through romantic relationships had proven devastatingly effective until Zara Williams' intervention disrupted the pattern. Meanwhile, the recovered prisoners from the cargo ship had all survived and were receiving ongoing medical and psychological treatment. Their testimonies had provided crucial evidence for prosecuting the captured members of Rebecca's network, but they had also revealed the true scope of the organization's cruelty. Maria Santos, a social worker who had been kidnapped to prevent her from testifying in a human trafficking case, told Detective Chun, "They kept us alive only as long as we were useful for threatening our families. If you hadn't arrived when you did, none of us would have survived." The rescue had been completed with minutes to spare. The cargo ship had sunk in water deep enough that recovering additional evidence was impossible, but the prisoners who were saved had provided enough testimony to ensure lengthy sentences for the captured criminals. Vincent Castellano, whose shipping company had provided the cargo vessel, received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His son Tommy Castellano, who had been David Sterling's associate, received 25 years in federal prison. The other captured members of the network received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. But the sentences, while satisfying from a justice perspective, couldn't undo the trauma experienced by the victims. Marcus Blackwood had sold his mansion and moved to a smaller home in another state, saying that he needed to start fresh in a place that wasn't haunted by memories of betrayal. "Detective Chun," he had said during their final conversation, "I want you to know that I don't blame David for what happened. He was as much a victim of his mother's manipulation as I was. I hope that when he gets out of prison, he'll be able to build a life that honors the second chance he's been given." The compassion Marcus showed toward David Sterling had impressed everyone involved in the case. Despite losing millions of dollars and nearly losing his life, he had chosen forgiveness over revenge. As Detective Chen sat in her new office at FBI headquarters, reviewing files on similar international criminal organizations, she reflected on how the case had changed everyone involved. David Sterling was learning accountability and empathy in federal prison. Marcus Blackwood was using his wealth to help other victims of crime. Judge Webb was fighting corruption with enhanced determination. Zara Williams was pursuing her education with the confidence that comes from knowing you've made a difference in the world. And Detective Chun herself had learned that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who hide behind facades of love and family relationships. Her sister's betrayal had been personally devastating, but it had also taught her to look for patterns of manipulation and exploitation that might not be immediately obvious. The phone on her desk rang with a call from Agent Park, who was coordinating a new investigation into suspected criminal activity involving wealthy families in California. Sarah, we've got a case that might interest you. A wealthy tech executive in San Francisco has reported that his girlfriend and her teenage son have been acting suspiciously. Financial irregularities, unexplained absences, and the girlfriend has been asking detailed questions about his business operations. Detective Chun felt a familiar chill. What's the girlfriend's background? That's the interesting part. Her identity checks out, but there are gaps in her history that suggest possible identity fabrication. The pattern is very similar to what you uncovered in the Sterling case. The possibility that Rebecca Chen's criminal methodology was being copied by other criminals was deeply troubling. Her sister had created a template for exploitation that could be replicated anywhere wealthy men were vulnerable to romantic manipulation. Agent Park, I'll be on the next flight to San Francisco. If this is connected to my sister's network, or if someone is copying her methods, we need to stop it before anyone else gets hurt. As Detective Chun prepared for another investigation that might involve confronting her family's legacy of criminal behavior, she thought about Zara Williams and the courage it had taken for a 10-year-old girl to speak truth to power. That same courage would be needed to fight the ongoing battle against criminals who used love and trust as weapons. The Sterling conspiracy case had ended with justice served and lives saved, but Detective Chin knew that the war against sophisticated criminal organizations was far from over. Somewhere in the shadows, new predators were always plotting to exploit the vulnerable and corrupt the innocent. But as long as there were people like Zara Williams willing to speak up, and investigators like herself dedicated to pursuing the truth regardless of personal cost, there was hope that justice would ultimately prevail over even the most cunning criminal enterprises. The final chapter of the Sterling conspiracy had been written, but Detective Chin's commitment to protecting the innocent was just beginning to take shape in new and challenging ways. The young man closed his eyes, clearly trying to recall conversations he had only partially understood at the time. She talked about operations in Miami, San Francisco, and somewhere in Europe. She said the American operations were just the beginning of something much larger. Judge Webb added his own intelligence. Detective, during my captivity, I overheard radio communications with cells in at least 4 different countries. This isn't just an American criminal organization. It's international in scope. The burning cargo ship was now listing at a 40-degree angle, and Coast Guard rescue boats were racing to reach it before it sank completely. But Detective Chin realized that even if they saved the immediate victims, the larger criminal enterprise that Rebecca Chun had built might survive to threaten future victims. Her radio crackled with an urgent message from Agent Park. Detective Chun, we've rescued 6 prisoners from the cargo ship, but we're still missing several people, including your sister. The ship's going down, and we haven't found her body. The possibility that Rebecca Chun had escaped in the chaos meant that the most dangerous criminal in the entire operation was still free. Detective Chun looked out at the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean and realized that somewhere in those waters, her sister might be planning her next move, possibly against the very people who had exposed her operation. The yacht Destiny had been secured, the immediate hostages were safe, and evidence was being gathered. But as Detective Chun watched the cargo ship slip beneath the waves in a hiss of steam and smoke, she knew that the real battle against Rebecca Chen's criminal empire was just beginning. Detective Chun checked her weapon and prepared for what might be the most dangerous confrontation of her career. The case that had started with a missing persons report and a child's testimony was about to culminate in a battle that would determine whether justice could triumph over an international criminal conspiracy that had used love, trust, and family relationships as weapons of exploitation. The yacht grew larger as they approached, and Detective Chun could see the fear on David Sterling's face as he tried to protect the elderly man while evading gunfire from his former associates. Whatever David's original role in the criminal operation, he was now clearly a target for elimination. The Coast Guard cutter pulled alongside the yacht, and tactical teams prepared for boarding. Detective Chin knew that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of the hostages, but whether they could capture enough evidence and suspects to dismantle the entire criminal network that had been operating under their noses for months. As she prepared to board the yacht, Detective Chin realized that her personal connection to Rebecca Chun would have to be addressed later. Right now, stopping the violence and saving lives was the only priority that mattered. Using boats to dispose of evidence and possibly victims. The yacht at the marina was just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that stretched far beyond what any of them had initially suspected. Detective Chun looked back toward shore, thinking about Zara Williams and her family, about Marcus Blackwood who had trusted the wrong people, and about how many other victims might be connected to David's operation. The brave little girl's warning had exposed something much bigger than a simple inheritance scam. Officer Martinez, coordinate with the Coast Guard and FBI. We're going to need multiple units and a comprehensive search of the area. As she spoke, the yacht's engine started up. David was making his move, possibly attempting to flee to international waters where extradition would be more complicated. All units, the suspect vessel is attempting to leave the marina. We need to intercept before they reach open water. The race was on. Detective Chin knew that if David's yacht escaped, they might lose their only chance to stop a criminal operation that had already claimed unknown numbers of victims. But she also knew that Zara Williams' courage had given them the advantage they needed to fight back against an evil that had hidden behind wealth and privilege for too long. The afternoon sun glinted off the water as police boats moved into position, preparing for a confrontation that would determine whether justice would prevail over the calculated cruelty of those who believed their money made them untouchable. At least until the police arrive. The admission that he had contacted law enforcement sent shockwaves through the room. Rebecca's face went pale, while David's expression hardened into something that looked capable of violence. "You've made a big mistake," David said softly. "The only mistake I made was trusting the wrong people," Marcus replied. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance. Detective Chun was coming, and, with her, the possibility of answers to questions Marcus was only beginning to understand. But he also knew that calling the police had escalated a situation that was already dangerous. As he watched Rebecca and David, Marcus realized that he had been living with strangers, people who had been playing roles while planning something that could have cost him everything, including his life. The little girl's warning had saved him, but, from what exactly, he was only beginning to comprehend. The sirens grew louder, and Marcus prepared himself for revelations that would change everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the price of wealth in a world where some people would kill for a chance at someone else's fortune.